Welcome to this Tutor to You AQA A-Level Sociology Paper 2 walkthrough video. In this video we're going to look at a 10-mark apply and analyse question from the Family and Households section on reasons for divorce. The 10-mark apply and analyse questions appear on all three papers and make up 40 out of 240 marks available, so it's important for students to be able to maximise their marks on these questions. The question itself is presented with an item, and students need to produce two extended paragraphs that must draw on information from the item that has been presented to answer the question that they have been posed. At the top end of the mark scheme, it requires students to analyse and or evaluate the explanation that has been offered in response to the question. This means in theory that students can get into the top mark band without evaluating, or they may do less analysis and an evaluation and still get into the top mark band. The most important thing for getting into that top mark band is that they produce two good responses to the question. Now the question is on screen and it is based upon the AQA A-Level style of questions that appear on paper 2. It has been written by Tutor to You for the purposes of this video. It's presented with an item and it says, item C, divorce is now more accessible and accepted in society. Women today are more likely to be employed, while changing expectations about marriage can also influence its stability. Sociologists suggest changes in society have led to changes in the divorce rate since the 1960s. And the question is asking students to apply material from item C, analyse two reasons changes in society have led to changes in the divorce rate since the 1960s. Now there are a number of hooks in this item that students may develop as their reasons, but these are present in the first paragraph only. The second paragraph, the one that begins with sociologists suggest changes in society, is a repetition of the question, and any hooks that are drawn from this part of the item would not be credited as a valid hook. So what do students have to do? Well, first of all, they need to identify at least two hooks in this item. Now, I've identified a number of different hooks and ways in which they can be developed. First of all, we can argue that divorce is now more accessible and accepted in society, and this may link into legal changes, or it may link into the reduction of stigma. A second hook would be that women are more likely to be employed, and this can link into changing career aspirations of women and increased financial independence. And changing expectations about marriage can link into functionalist ideas such as those put forward by Fletcher about the higher expectations that are expected of people when they're in a relationship, or it could also link into the growth of individualism and Giddens' ideas of confluent love. What students need to do is to develop those hooks, attach them to a reason, and explain how divorce has changed over the last 60 years. So how do some of these hooks link to the effect? Well, we're going to concentrate on two. First of all, accessible and accepted. Now, as I've mentioned, we could link this into divorce reform, or we can link it to less stigma regarding divorce, which is the way we're going to go. Once we've linked it to our reason, we need to explain how this has led to changes in divorce, and we need to be very specific about how the divorce rate has changed. For example, we can suggest that the process of secularization has meant that there is less stigma attached to people getting divorced, and we would explain what secularization is and how that has led to reduced stigma. For example, talking about unhappy marriages being able to end because there is less stigma in society, and how this links into rates of divorce. So we can suggest that the reduction of stigma will lead to many unhappy marriages ending, whereas in the past this may not have been the case because it was frowned upon in society to be divorced. It's linking into the rate of divorce increasing, We can also link this in to the decline from the 1990s onwards in the number of divorces through linking secularisation to declining marriage and therefore declining divorce, which shows both changes that we've seen in the divorce rate since the 1960s. A second way we could do this is by talking about women's participation in paid work. This can be then linked to the rise of individualism, people looking after their own needs before the needs of their partner, how they look for emotional satisfaction and individual fulfillment. And this can be linked in then to greater financial independence that women have because they have chosen a career. Perhaps we could link in Hakim's preference theory here, and how this then has people being able to leave unhappy marriages because they are no longer economically dependent upon their partner. So you can see the process here, that women's participation in paid work links to the rise of individualism and greater financial independence and their ability to leave unhappy marriages, which leads to a rise in the rate of divorce. Once again, we could link this also into the decline in the number of marriages or marriages occurring later in life. And we can also link it into other concepts such as Giddens' ideas of individualism. But let's look at this in practice. So first of all, the student has suggested a way in which divorce rates have changed since the 1960s by saying divorce rates have increased since the 1960s, and one important reason for this is that divorce has become more accessible and accepted, as seen in item A. So they've made their item hook link and they've explained that there is a reason. Now we need to develop that hook. And the students developed it by talking about the acceptance of divorce in contemporary society is a result of reduced stigma in society, with divorce now more commonplace following legal changes such as the Divorce Reform Act. So they've gone down the route of legislation, but also that this legislation has then reduced stigma. They then developed that by talking about how that legal change reflects wider social and cultural shifts. And as item A states, divorce has become more accepted in society. So there's a repetition there of the item. This links to the process of secularisation, where influence of religion has declined. So there's lots of concepts in this. The student could have gone simpler by talking about legislative changes, describing the changes that occur in the Divorce Reform Act, and then perhaps evaluating it. But they've gone through different stages here, how Divorce Reform Act leads to reduced stigma. Another impact of reduced stigma is secularisation. They've linked in some research. Sociologists such as Weeks argue that religious institutions have less power to shape moral views, meaning fewer people feel marriage must be lifelong. As stigma around divorce has decreased, more people may be willing to leave unhappy relationships, which contributes towards higher divorce rates. So they've linked it in there specifically to a trend in divorce rates. Additionally, this explains the decline of the number of marriages and subsequently divorces from the mid 1990s, as secularisation also explains why people no longer feel the need to marry, leading to less divorces after the initial increase in divorce. So there's lots of analysis in here, looking at lots of different reasons. What the student has done well, though, is linked those reasons together. Divorce reform and secularisation lead to reduction of stigma. The reduction of stigma leads to an increase in the rates of divorce. They've then sort of like seen how the reduction of stigma has also impacted on marriage, which is not necessary for the answer. But what they've done then is explained how the reduction in marriage has actually led to another change in the rates of divorce. So they've got really good knowledge there, possibly more than they needed to have. Our second response, another reason as highlighted in item A, is women's increased participation in paid work. We need to develop this. Since the 1960s, more women have joined the workforce, gaining both financial independence and confidence. This is in part due to changes in women's career aspirations, as highlighted by Sharp. So a bit of research here from Sue Sharp. Perhaps the student could have developed women's career aspirations that Sharp has mentioned by talking about Sharp's research. However, they've gone with a different route, and they've used another piece of research to back those findings up, saying that women choose to prioritise careers over marriage, and Hakim's preference theory suggests that many women choose careers over family and as a result are more financially independent. What the student hasn't done so far, though, is linked this to changes in the divorce rate, and that's what we would be expecting to see in the remainder of this paragraph. They've talked about career aspirations, and they've talked about how it has led to financial independence, but they've not yet linked it to divorce. As a result, those women who do choose to marry are no longer economically dependent upon their husbands, thus reducing the barriers to leaving unhappy or unequal marriages. So here is our link to divorce. And the student has developed it a little bit further by talking about how Giddens argues that modern relationships are based on emotional satisfaction and individual fulfillment, rather than duty or economic dependence. This is reflected in higher levels of divorce than in the modern era, with people choosing not to remain in unhappy marriages. Now, you could argue that the student here has given us more than two reasons, but the reasons are building upon each other. So the idea of not only economic dependence, but also fulfillment within that relationship, particularly for women who've chosen careers, that there will be an increase in the level of divorce if people are in an unhappy marriage. Now, if we look at some exam gold, the 10-mark apply and analyse questions can use analysis and or evaluation to reach the top mark band. In both of the responses we've seen, it has largely been analysis. Two good responses will include either analysis, they will include evaluation, or they will include both in those responses. But it's those key AO3 skills that get students into the top mark band on this question. That concludes this Tutor to You AQA A-Level Sociology Paper 2 walkthrough video looking at a 10-mark apply and analyse question from families and households, looking at two reasons for divorce. Thanks for watching.